The air tasted like nothing. Emery Voss sealed her second glove with a snap, double-layered nitrile, the specific shade of purple that meant pharmaceutical grade, and checked the gowning room mirror. A person-shaped absence stared back. Tyvek coverall, hood pressing her dark hair flat, goggles that turned her eyes into something clinical. She looked like an astronaut who'd given up on space and settled for sterility. 12 hours. That was the job tonight. Sit in a sealed clean room for 12 continuous hours while particle counters cycled and sensors recorded data. Two people would be present the entire time, or the $2.3 million qualification test was void. Both people in full gowning, hoods, goggles, double gloves, coveralls. No skin exposed. No skin contact. No phones, no books, no distractions that might shed particles into 800 square feet of pharmaceutical-grade air. She'd done these overnights before. They were tedious by design. She usually smuggled a novel under her workstation and read during the waiting intervals between testing cycles. Tonight she'd packed Piranesi. It was in her locker, and she would not touch it once. The airlock hissed as she pressed through. The clean room opened around her, bright, white, humming. Stainless steel surfaces, fluorescent light that erased every shadow, and the constant low drone of HEPA filtration, air being scrubbed clean of everything interesting. A digital clock glowed red above the door. Midnight. Someone was already at the far workstation. He turned when she entered, a shape in Tyvek, same as her. Hood, goggles, double gloves. She could see his badge through the clear pocket on his chest. Nakano, J. Process Engineering. Voss, he said. That's me. Nakano. I'm the process engineer on this project. He extended a gloved hand, and she shook it, nitrile on nitrile, the dead grip of two people touching through 4 layers of polymer. No warmth. No texture. No information at all except hand, present solid. I was told this would be straightforward. It will be. 12 hours, 6 testing cycles, particle counts between runs. The exciting part is the air. She gestured at the room. It's very clean. Something shifted behind his goggles. It might have been a smile. She couldn't tell. Clean room goggles reflected the fluorescent light at angles that made expressions theoretical. She could determine that he was looking at her, but not whether he was amused or regretting his career choices. I brought a procedural manual to review, he said. In case there's downtime. There's about 40 minutes of waiting between each cycle. Then I'll read fast. She almost laughed. She didn't, not yet, not with a stranger, but the impulse registered, and that was unusual. Emery didn't generally feel impulses toward strangers. She felt professionalism, which was different and more useful. They worked in parallel for the first 45 minutes. Baseline measurements, environmental confirmation, the tedious verification that the room was performing to specification. She called out readings. He recorded them. Their voices were efficient, clipped, professional, the kind of conversation that could have been conducted by 2 machines with better social skills. She noticed his hands during the baseline check. Gloved, obviously, but the way he handled the equipment was specific. Precise without being fussy. He held the particle counter the way someone holds an instrument they've used 1,000 times, absently, confidently, with the unconscious grace of deep familiarity. She noticed this noticing and filed it under irrelevant. The first waiting interval settled over them like snowfall. She sat at her workstation. He sat at his 5 feet to her left, both facing the blank wall. The HEPA hum filled the space between them, a low drone just below the frequency of conversation. Not loud enough to require shouting, but present enough that silence was never actually silent. So, he said. So, 11 hours and 12 minutes. Give or take. A particle counter clicked softly on the east wall, the sound of air being measured and found acceptable. What made you choose contamination control? He asked. Not what is contamination control, what made her choose it. People didn't usually ask why. Why implied that the choice contained information about the chooser, and most people didn't look for information in other people's careers. They looked for categories. The industry's growing, she said. Pharmaceutical manufacturing has strict regulatory requirements and qualified contamination control specialists. That's why the industry exists. I asked why you chose it. She glanced at him. Through two sets of goggles and a hood, she could make out almost nothing of his face. Just the sense that he was looking at her, not at the wall, with the particular focus of someone who had asked a question and intended to hear the answer. His voice was calm in a way she was beginning to suspect was practiced rather than natural, like he learned to sound steady the way some people learn to keep their hands still. I like rooms with rules, she said. The HEPA hum counted 4 seconds of silence. That's a real answer, he said. Thank you. You're welcome. Why process engineering? I like designing the rules for the rooms. She laughed. A short sound, half surprise, that escaped before she could shape it into something professional. Here, where every sound was dampened by HEPA-filtered air, it was startlingly alive. The room swallowed it almost instantly, but for a moment the space had contained something real. That's the first real sound anyone's made in here, he said. Everything else has been professional. We're being professional. We are. I'm just noting that your laugh is the first thing in this room that isn't. She didn't know what to say to that. Emery generally knew what to say. She was good at professional conversation the way she was good at particle counts, with precision and without lingering. But his observation had landed somewhere between compliment and clinical notation, and she couldn't decide which one to respond to. The second testing cycle saved her. They moved through it with the easy confidence of two people who understood the equipment, calling numbers back and forth. His hands moved over the instruments with the specificity she'd noticed before. He wasn't just recording data. He was reading the room the way she did. Pressure differentials, airflow patterns, the subtle variations that told you whether a space was performing consistently or just hitting its numbers on the average. You're good at this, she said, before she meant to. You sound surprised. Process engineers usually stay in the office. They don't volunteer for 12-hour overnights. I don't usually volunteer for overnights. What made this one different? A pause. The HEPA system breathed its single endless note. My apartment is very quiet, he said. I thought a room with someone in it might be a nice change. The sentence opened a small window into something she recognized, the particular silence of a space inhabited by one person who used to inhabit it with someone else. She knew that silence. She'd been living in it for 4 months, ever since Ryan had packed his running shoes into the box by the door and carried them to a car she'd watched from the window without waving. Divorced? She asked. Too direct. She heard it leave her mouth and wished she could pull it back through the HEPA system and have it filtered into something more appropriate. 2 years, he said. Easily, like it was context and not confession. Amicably. Which is almost worse, because there's no one to be angry at. You can't slam a door on someone who's holding it open for you. I know what you mean. Divorced. Ended a relationship. 3 years. 4 months ago. Amicably. What had actually happened was that Ryan had said, I love you, but I can't reach you and I'm tired of trying. And she had said, I understand, because she did understand, and understanding was easier than arguing. And she had spent the 4 months since wondering if I understand was the correct response to someone leaving or just the most controlled one. He said I was impossible to reach, she said. So, semi-amicably. Nakano was quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet of someone who wished they hadn't asked. She knew that quiet, the social squirm of people who accidentally stepped past the small talk boundary. This was the attentive quiet of someone who was actually listening. She'd forgotten what that sounded like. Impossible to reach is a strange criticism, he said. It puts the failure on the person being reached instead of the person reaching. She turned in her chair to look at him. Two shapes in Tyvek, 5 feet apart in the cleanest room in the building, having a conversation about emotional accessibility at 11 p.m. while dressed in full protective gowning. We're talking about my ex in a clean room, she said. We are. At 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. Also true. While dressed like hazmat astronauts. The goggles really complete the look. She smiled. He couldn't see it. The hood covered everything below her goggles, but she thought maybe he could hear it, the way a smile changes the shape of a voice. In a space where faces didn't exist, voices carried everything. Every inflection, every pause, every shift in register was amplified by the absence of visual information. She couldn't read his expression. She could read his voice like a particle counter reads air, with granular precision, detecting variations that would be invisible in any other context. The clock read 3 hours and 7 seconds. 3 hours down. 9 to go. They'd settled into a rhythm without deciding to test, wait, talk, test. The conversations during the waiting intervals had drifted from professional to personal the way a boat drifts from the dock, slowly enough that you don't notice until the shore is somewhere else entirely. He mentioned his divorce as context, not confession. I moved to Portland for the job. My ex-wife kept the house in San Jose. Fair trade, she hated the rain. She'd found herself offering facts in return. Not the curated version. Real ones. He left his running shoes by the door for 3 weeks after he moved out, she said. I kept them there for 2 more because the apartment looked less empty with shoes in it. That's a very precise kind of sadness. I'm a very precise kind of person. I've noticed. She caught herself listening for his voice during the third testing cycle. Not the words, the sound of it. He had 2 registers. The professional one, measured and clear. And another one, lower, less structured, that surfaced when he forgot someone was listening. When he was thinking out loud about a sensor reading. When he answered a question she hadn't expected him to take seriously. His voice sounds different when he's not trying to be professional, she thought. Lower. Like he forgot someone was listening. She filed it under irrelevant. The folder was getting full. Outside the clean room, the facility had emptied. Inside, the fluorescent light held steady, timeless, indifferent to the hour. There were no windows, no weather, no indication that the world outside existed at all. Just 2 people in a white room, talking more honestly than either of them had talked to anyone in months, unable to see each other's faces. Her chair was closer to us than it had been an hour ago. She hadn't decided to move it. She noticed, and she didn't move it back. Past midnight, time stopped meaning anything. The clock on the wall said 1 hour, 14 minutes, and 22 seconds, but it could have been any hour in any season. The fluorescent panels emitted the same flat, shadowless light they'd emitted at 8 p.m. The HEPA system hummed its one constant note. The clean room existed outside of time, a pocket of controlled atmosphere where the only evidence of passing hours was the gradual loosening of 2 people's professional voices. Emery had pulled her workstation chair to face Nakano's sometime during the 3rd testing cycle. She couldn't have said exactly when. It was a decision her body had made without consulting the rest of her, the unconscious drift toward a voice she wanted to hear better. Not because the HEPA hum required them to lean closer, though it did. Because his voice had a quality she kept trying to name and couldn't. Something in the pauses. The way he left space after her sentences instead of filling it, as if silence were a gift rather than an awkwardness. Attention, she thought. He sounds like someone who is paying attention. Question, he said. Answer. What book did you bring? You said you usually bring a novel for the overnights. I did. It's in my locker. Tragically out of reach. What is it? She hesitated, not because the answer was embarrassing, but because the question felt like a door she'd usually keep closed. What a person read alone at 2 a.m. in a room they weren't supposed to be reading in was a kind of confession. Piranesi, she said. The silence that followed was shaped differently than the others. She could feel him recalibrating. Susanna Clark, he said. You've read it. Twice. Twice is that's not a casual read. That's a relationship with a book. It's not a casual book. He shifted in his chair, and the Tyvek rustled, the loudest sound in the room besides their voices. I read it the first time for the architecture. The halls, the ocean, the statues. The second time I read it for the loneliness. The loneliness. Yes, that was the book, beneath the architecture and the mystery. A man alone in an unimaginable space, cataloging its wonders with the meticulous devotion of someone who has made peace with solitude by turning it into purpose. Not realizing he was trapped because the trap was beautiful enough to feel like home. The thing about Piranesi, she said, is that he's the most content character I've ever read. He's alone in this vast, impossible house, and he's happy. He genuinely doesn't know he's missing anything. The world is exactly the size of his experience, and his experience is enough. And then he finds out. And then he finds out. And you can't decide if knowing is better or worse. Better, James said, without hesitation, without the measured pause she'd come to expect before his answers. You think so? Knowing is always better, even when it costs you the contentment, because the happiness you lose was built on an incomplete picture. And an incomplete picture might be beautiful, but it's not, he stopped. It's not real. She wondered if he was talking about books or about himself. She suspected both. You brought a procedural manual, she said, because the conversation needed to breathe. You brought homework to the clean room, and you've read Piranesi twice. People contain multitudes. Also, the procedural manual is genuinely interesting. It is not. The section on bioburden testing has a narrative arc. It does not. Setup, rising action, climax at the colony-forming unit threshold, denouement in the corrective action protocol. Classic three-act structure. She laughed a real laugh, the kind that escaped before she could shape it. It filled the clean room for a full second before the filtered air absorbed it, and in that second the room felt less like a laboratory and more like a place where two people were being ridiculous together. 50 shades of particulate matter, he said. Stop. Pride and differential pressure. I'm going to report you to compliance. For what? Making me laugh in a clean room. It's a contamination risk. I'll take the write-up. Worth it. She could hear the smile in his voice, and hearing a smile was somehow more intimate than seeing one. A seen smile could be performed. A heard smile was involuntary. The fourth testing cycle came and went. The data was clean. Emery logged the results, but her attention was split, half on the instruments, half on the rustle of his Tyvek as he moved between sensors. She was hyper-aware of proximity. The clean room was 800 square feet, but they kept ending up in the same quarter of it. When he moved to check a particle counter, she found herself at the adjacent workstation. When she crossed to log data, the space between their chairs was the width of a hand. His arm brushed hers during the sensor check. Tyvek on Tyvek, 4 layers of protective material between his arm and hers. She felt it like voltage. They both pulled back at the same time. Sorry, he said. It's fine. It was not fine. The protocol required full gowning. Full gowning meant no skin contact, and the prohibition had turned every accidental brush of fabric into something her nervous system processed as an event. Her arm was tingling where his had touched it. Through Tyvek. Through nitrile. Through the most controlled air in the building. She sat down. He sat down. The 5 feet between their chairs was an ocean. Tell me about your divorce, she said. Not a question she'd planned. A question the hour demanded. We didn't fight, he said. That was the whole problem. We were so careful with each other that we stopped being real. Every conversation was scripted. Every evening was a stage direction. Enter husband. Sit on couch. Ask about her day. Listen to response. Offer appropriate comment. Exit to kitchen. I was performing the marriage instead of living it. When did you notice? She rearranged the living room one weekend. Moved everything. I came home and sat down in the new arrangement and thought, this is different. And then I thought, nothing else is. The furniture moved and we didn't. The sentence landed in Emery's sternum. The image of a man sitting on a rearranged couch in an unchanged marriage was so vivid that she felt she understood his entire divorce in 6 words. I think my ex was right, she said. That I'm impossible to reach. But I think he meant I was impossible to reach for him. And I think there's a difference between being unreachable and being reached by the wrong person in the wrong way. Is it possible, he said, that you're easier to reach when the reaching isn't physical? When someone can't rely on eye contact and body language and all the usual shortcuts. You're asking if I'm easier to know when no one can see my face. I'm asking if the gowning helps. Yes, she said. The gowning helps. Then I'm glad we're here. She wanted to say something back, something that matched the quiet weight of that, but the words were all too big or too small. The silence said it for her. You know, he said, and his voice had shifted into something she hadn't heard before, careful, almost clinical, as if he were testing a hypothesis and half hoping he was wrong. I think the gowning isn't just helping. I think it's doing the same thing for you that the clean room does for the air, filtering out everything that isn't essential. You're not easier to reach in here because you're different. You're easier to reach because you can't perform being unreachable. The tools you use, the face, the composure, the distance, they're not available. And without them, stop. The word came out harder than she intended. Not loud, Emery didn't get loud. She got quiet and precise, the way a scalpel is quiet and precise, and the clean room absorbed the sound the way it absorbed everything, which made the silence afterward feel surgical. He stopped. The HEPA system hummed. The fluorescent lights buzzed. A particle counter clicked on the east wall, measuring air that was cleaner than anything between them. "I'm sorry," he said. That was a lot. "I know. You don't know me well enough to say that." The sentence was a door closing. She could hear it, the click of the latch, the professional distance reasserting itself like positive pressure pushing contaminated air out of a clean room. She was good at this. She'd been doing it for 33 years. The controlled withdrawal, the recalibration of distance, the smooth return to a surface that no one could reach past. Ryan had called it impossible. It wasn't impossible. It was easy. It was the easiest thing she did. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize again. He sat in his chair, 5 feet away, and he let the silence be what it was. The fifth testing cycle began. They moved through it professionally, sensor readings, particle counts, data logging. Their voices were efficient and clipped, the way they'd been at 8 p.m., 12 centuries ago. She called out numbers. He recorded them. They did not look at each other, which in a room where no one could see anyone's face was a feat of deliberate non-attention. The waiting interval after the fifth cycle was the worst silence of the night. Not empty, loaded. She could feel him choosing not to speak, and the choosing was louder than words. 3 minutes. 4. The HEPA system breathed for both of them. "I had a goldfish when I was 8, he said. She blinked. "What?" "A goldfish. His name was President Business. From the Lego movie." She didn't respond. She wasn't going to make this easy. "He died after 3 days. And I was devastated, completely destroyed, the way only an 8-year-old can be destroyed by a goldfish. And my mom said, 'James, you loved that fish for 3 days, and that's 3 days of love that fish wouldn't have had otherwise.' Which is a beautiful thing to say to a grieving child." He paused. "It's also a terrible way to approach relationships as an adult, which I have done. Repeatedly." She didn't laugh. She wanted to. The image of an 8-year-old James mourning a goldfish named President Business was precisely ridiculous, but she was still holding the door closed and laughing would open it. "I overstepped," he said. "Back there. I heard something true about you, and I grabbed at it with both hands instead of waiting for you to show me." That's another pause. "That's what I do. It's what ended my marriage, actually, the other side of it. I wasn't just performing. I was also, when she was real, when she actually said something honest, I'd dissect it. I'd try to understand it faster than she was ready to explain it. She said it felt like being studied instead of heard." The HEPA system hummed. "I don't want to study you," he said. "I want to hear you. Those are different things. I'm not always good at the difference." Emery sat in the clean room's flat, merciless light, and felt something shift inside her that she didn't have a name for. Not forgiveness, he hadn't hurt her. Not comfort, she wasn't injured. Something more specific, the recognition that he had pushed too hard, and instead of justifying the push, he had shown her exactly why he pushed. Not a defense. A diagnosis. "This is the thing I do wrong, and here is where I learned it, and I am telling you because you deserve to know the shape of the flaw before you decide whether to keep talking to me." It was, she thought, the most honest apology she'd ever received. And it had come from a man she couldn't see, in a room designed to prevent contamination, at 2 in the morning. "President Business," she said. "President Business. 3 days. He was a good fish. Very professional. Excellent at meetings." She felt the door open. Not all the way. She wasn't going to pretend the last 15 minutes hadn't happened. But enough. Enough to let the air back in. "The thing you said," she told him, "about the gowning filtering out everything that isn't essential. I shouldn't have, you weren't wrong." She paused. The words cost something, and she let them cost it. "You weren't wrong, and I shut you down because you weren't wrong, and that's the thing my ex was talking about. That's the impossible to reach part." Someone sees me accurately, and I close the door. You opened it again. I'm opening it again. That's for me. That's a lot. I know it is. Don't study it. I won't. The sixth testing cycle ran itself. They sat in their chairs, 5 feet apart, and the 5 feet felt different than they had 30 minutes ago. Not smaller, more honest. The distance had been tested. It had contracted and contracted again, and now it was a distance they'd both chosen instead of one they'd defaulted to. Around hour 7, the conversation found a ledge and stepped off it. They were facing each other, chairs angled together, close enough that she could see the fogging on his goggles when he exhaled. In this room, right now, he said, "What scares you?" She wanted to say nothing. The word was right there, her default, her first defense. That I'm easier to talk to when no one can see my face, she said. That I have been more honest with you in 7 hours than I was in 3 years with someone who slept in my bed. She paused. And that 20 minutes ago, I almost ended this conversation because you saw that about me, and I would have spent the rest of the night in professional silence and told myself it was the right call. Would it have been? It would have been safe. That's not what I asked. No, it wouldn't have been the right call. The silence after was the longest of the night. Not empty, full of the HEPA hum and the fluorescent buzz and his breathing and hers, and the enormous fact of having said something true and not having the door closed on it. That's not a flaw, he said. That's information. Information about what? About what you need. Some people are easier to reach through touch, some through shared experience. You're easier to reach through voice, through honesty without performance, through a room where the usual armor doesn't work and the usual exits don't exist. He paused. That's not broken. That's specific. She was glad for the goggles, because her eyes were doing something she would not have wanted anyone to see. 8 hours down. 4 to go. She sat in the humming white room with a man she couldn't see, whose voice she could have picked out of a crowd of thousands, and realized she didn't want the test to end. The thought was so absurd that she wanted to stay in a sterile pharmaceutical facility with a stranger she couldn't touch, that she almost laughed. Instead, she leaned forward and said, "Tell me something you've never told anyone." He didn't ask why. He didn't deflect. He was quiet for a long time. The HEPA system breathed. The clock counted seconds in red. "Okay," he said. "I moved to Portland 8 months ago," he said. "I've unpacked the kitchen and the bedroom. The rest is still in boxes." The HEPA system hummed. The clock's red digits had ticked past the 8-hour mark, and the clean room was the same room it had been since the beginning, same light, same hum, same controlled air. But Emery was listening with her whole body now. She had asked him to tell her something he'd never told anyone. He was doing it. "Not because I'm lazy," he said. "Because opening the boxes means I live here. And if I live here, then the divorce is real, and the house in San Jose belongs to someone else's life, and I have to figure out who I am in a city where no one knows me." A breath. The HEPA system processed it into nothing. "I think I've been living in a clean room of my own. Controlled environment. No variables. No risk of contamination from anything real." She heard all of it, not just the words, but the specific courage of saying them. He had watched her close a door on him an hour ago, and when she'd opened it again and asked for something real, he'd given it without hesitation, without protecting himself first. She wondered if he knew how rare that was. "You know what's in the boxes," he said. "What?" "Books. Mostly books. And a set of bowls my grandmother gave me that don't match anything. And a photo of President Business." "You kept a photo of the goldfish?" "My mom took it the day we got him. He's in the bag from the pet store, and I'm holding the bag like it contains the most important thing in the world." A pause. "I was 8. It did." Something inside Emery's chest did a thing she did not authorize. A softening. A shift in pressure, like the room had changed its airflow pattern and was pushing her in a direction she hadn't chosen. "Open the boxes," she said. "What?" "When you get home. Open the boxes. Put the books on shelves and the bowls in the cabinet and the photo of President Business somewhere you can see it." She paused. The clean room is a good metaphor, but it's a terrible way to live. "I should know." He was quiet. Then, is that professional advice or personal? I'm not sure there's a difference anymore. Not in here. No, he said. Not in here. The ninth hour passed. They moved past confession, past the careful exchange of vulnerabilities, into a space where talking to James felt less like disclosure and more like breathing. Involuntary. Continuous. Impossible to stop. She kept noticing his hands. She'd been watching them all night, the way he held a sensor probe, the way his right hand rested on his knee with the fingers slightly curled, and she'd started imagining what they looked like under the nitrile. If there were calluses, if the skin was warm, if his fingers would feel different from every other hand she'd ever held, or if they'd feel the same and the difference would be entirely in the fact that they were his. Tell me this isn't happening in a clean room, she said. Tell me I'm not having the most important conversation of my life while dressed like a hazmat astronaut. This isn't normal, he said. I know. This is better than normal. She memorized his voice saying that, filed it in a place that was not irrelevant. The alarm hit like a physical force. A siren sharp, oscillating, designed to cut through the HEPA hum and any conversation, any thought, any moment that might have been building between two people in a white room at 4 in the morning. Red lights strobed on the environmental monitoring panel. The digital readout next to the particle counter spiked into triple digits. Loss of pressurization alert. Loss of pressurization Emery was on her feet before the second cycle. Training took over 12 years of contamination control, of knowing that this alert meant the room's positive pressure had dropped and outside air could be flooding in. Particles, bacteria, every contaminant the HEPA system existed to prevent. If the room had actually lost pressure, the test was void. 6 months of preparation, 2 months of scheduling, 9 hours of their lives, $2.3 million, all of it worthless. Pressure differential, she said, already at the environmental panel. Check the door seals. On it. They worked in sync, fast, focused, professional in a way that erased the last 9 hours of personal conversation like a whiteboard wiped clean. He checked the airlock seals while she pulled up the pressure logs. She verified the HEPA system output while he ran a manual particle count. The alarm screamed its two-note pattern. The red lights pulsed. The first readings came back ambiguous. Pressure differential was fluctuating, not crushed, but not nominal. The sensor on panel 3 was spiking and recovering, the numbers oscillating between acceptable and catastrophic like a heart in arrhythmia. Panel 3 is erratic, she said. I can't get a stable reading. Door seals are intact. Both airlocks. Check the HEPA velocity. If the filtration system dropped on it. Her hands were steady. They were always steady during an alarm. That was the thing about rooms with rules, about a career built on protocol. When the alarm sounds, you don't feel. You measure. You follow the procedure, and you let the data tell you whether to panic. The data was not cooperating. Panel 3 continued its erratic dance. She pulled up the redundant sensors, panels 1, 2, 4, 5, and waited for their readings to populate. The alarm screamed. The red lights pulsed. The seconds stretched. HEPA velocity is nominal, James said from across the room. Output is within spec. Then, quieter, in a voice the alarm almost swallowed, if the test voids, we have to leave. She heard what he didn't say. Not we lose the data. Not the qualification fails. We have to leave. The room. Each other. Whatever was building between them in the filtered air. If the test voids, the 12 hours end now, and they walk out of this building as two professionals who failed a qualification and never had a reason to speak again. Redundant sensors are loading, she said. She stared at the screen. Come on. Come on. Panels 1 and 2, nominal. Panel 4, nominal. Panel 5, nominal. Panel 3, still spiking. Sensor malfunction, she said, and the relief in her voice was unprofessional, and she did not care. Panel 3 has an intermittent fault. The redundant sensors all confirm nominal conditions. The room held. The room held. The room held. The test is intact. We stay. The last two words came out before she could filter them. We stay. Not the test continues. Not the qualification is preserved. She had said the quiet part out loud, and the clean room, which absorbed every real sound, every laugh, every honest word, absorbed this one too, but not before he heard it. Good, he said. And then, softer, good. She lobbed the false alarm and noted the sensor fault for the report. Her hands were still steady. The rest of her was not. The alarm fell silent. The red strobe stopped. The HEPA system reasserted its constant hum, and the clean room settled back into its baseline, same air, same light, same controlled nothing. But the silence after the alarm was not the silence before the alarm. The silence before had been full of two people talking. The silence after was full of two people who had just realized, simultaneously and without saying it, what they stood to lose. Not the test. Not the $2.3 million. Each other. The remaining hours. The chance to finish whatever sentence they'd been building all night. She stood at the environmental panel. He stood at the east wall. 10 feet apart. Still in professional mode, still reading instruments, still checking numbers that had already been checked. Neither of them moving back to the chairs. Neither of them resuming the conversation. Because the alarm had stripped away the gradual drift of the evening and shown them both, in 2 minutes of siren and strobing light, exactly what this night had become, and the knowing was bigger than the talking. That was intense, she said finally. I was going to say, well handled. You moved fast. It's my job. I know. I'm still saying it. She looked at him across the room and stopped. His hood had shifted. During the scramble, the quick movements, the reaching for panels, the urgency that had overridden 9 hours of careful gestures, the elastic seal had pulled loose on one side. Not off. Not enough to break protocol, but shifted, tugged sideways by centimeters so that a strip of his face was visible below the goggles and above the hood's lower edge. The line of his jaw, the shadow under his cheekbone, the corner of his mouth. One eye dark looking at her. 9 hours. She had spent 9 hours building him from voice alone, constructing a face from the cadence of his breathing, the sound of his laugh, the specific way he paused before saying something true. She had imagined his features the way you imagine a room you've only heard described, with confidence that dissolved the instant you actually saw it, because reality was never what imagination predicted. Reality was always more specific, more particular, more this and less any. His jaw was sharper than she'd imagined. The skin below his cheekbone was shadowed in a way that suggested angles, not softness. The corner of his mouth, the part she could see, was set in an expression she would have called serious if she hadn't just heard him say good twice, the second time like a prayer. And the eye, dark, tired, looking at her with the unguarded focus of someone who has been seen in fragments and is deciding whether to mind. She stared. She couldn't stop. After 9 hours of the anonymous uniformity of full gowning, this fragment was devastating, not because it was beautiful, but because it was actual. A real face. A specific person. Not the voice she'd been falling for, but the human being who made it, partial and imperfect, and suddenly the most interesting thing in 800 square feet of controlled air. Your hood, she said. Her voice came out wrong, compressed. Like the room had lost pressure after all, and the thing that had depressurized was her. He reached up, touched the loosened seal. You should fix it. Yes. She wanted to say don't. She wanted to say let me see. She said neither, because the protocol was the protocol and his career and hers and $2.3 million were real things that existed outside of whatever was happening to her nervous system. He resecured the hood. The elastic pulled taut. The fragment of his face disappeared, and the anonymity closed around him like water over a stone. But it was too late. She'd seen him. Not fully, just a piece, a glimpse, the visual equivalent of a sentence interrupted mid-word. And the interruption was worse than the complete sentence would have been, because her imagination was already filling in the rest. And the face she was constructing from one eye and a jawline and 9 hours of wanting was more vivid than any face she'd ever seen in full. This is a problem, she thought. This is a $2.3 million, 12-year career, completely unacceptable problem. I don't care. The alarm had triggered the backup lighting system. The fluorescence died with a click, sudden, absolute, like the room had blinked, and the emergency panels activated. Amber-toned. Warm. Casting the first shadows the clean room had seen all night. The room transformed. Not physically, same dimensions, same steel surfaces, same hepahum. But the flat clinical brightness was gone, replaced by a warm amber glow that turned the steel golden and created corners where darkness gathered like something gentle. For the first time, the clean room had depth, had shadows, had the quality of a room where things could happen that weren't on the protocol. Huh, James said, looking around. The backup system is rated for emergency egress, not testing operations. I know. I designed the lighting plan for this facility. Then you know it wasn't designed for ambience. It wasn't. And yet, the two most dangerous words in a clean room. Maintenance could reset the primary lighting remotely, but it would take an hour at 4:30 in the morning. The clean room belonged to the amber light now, and to the two people sitting closer together than protocol recommended. She sat down. He sat down, 3 feet apart. In the warm light, she could see details she hadn't before: the fogging on his goggles when he breathed, the slight movement of Tyvek over his chest. The relationship with Ryan was a clean room, she said. She hadn't planned to say it. The sentence arrived fully formed, delivered by some part of her that had been assembling it all night and had chosen the amber light to hand it over. James didn't move, didn't speak, waited. An hour ago, you said the gowning filters out everything that isn't essential. That I'm easier to reach because I can't perform being unreachable. She paused. You were right, and I want to finish what you started. I remember overstepping. You overstepped, and you were right. I chose this career because I don't trust myself in uncontrolled environments. Controlled variables, clear protocols, rooms where the rules are posted on the wall, those are the places where I function. Not because I'm good at rules. Because rules mean I never have to be, she stopped. The sentence was there, fully formed, but saying it out loud in a room with another person was different from thinking it in the safe, sterile privacy of her own head. Known, he said quietly. She looked at him. That's the word you're looking for. You don't have to say it. I can hear it. I thought you weren't going to study me. I'm not studying you. I'm listening. There's a difference. He paused. But if I'm wrong, tell me. You're not wrong. The amber light turned the stainless steel surfaces into something warm, and the HEPA system hummed its single note, and Emery said the rest of it. I didn't just build a career around not being known. I built a life around it. The relationship with Ryan wasn't a failure of communication. It was a clean room. I kept the variables controlled. I kept the air filtered. And he spent 3 years trying to reach a person who had designed her entire environment to prevent exactly that. Her voice was steady. Her hands inside the gloves were not. What I'm afraid of is that outside this room, I'll go back to the clean room version of myself, and this, whatever this is, will be something that only existed because the gowning forced me to be real. Can I? He stopped. Started again, more carefully, and she could hear him choosing his approach the way she'd heard him choose it after President Business. Not studying. Listening. I want to say something, but I'm aware of my track record tonight with saying things, and I don't want to say it. You weren't forced. He spoke slowly, giving each word space. The gowning removed some of your tools, but you chose to talk to me. You chose to answer my questions honestly instead of professionally. You chose to open the door after I was an idiot about it. A pause. The room didn't make you real, Emery. You decided to be. That was you, not the protocol. She sat with that, turned it over in the amber light. That's either the most comforting thing anyone's ever said to me, she said, or the most terrifying. Because if you're right, then I can't blame the room. And if I can't blame the room, then the thing I'm most afraid of, that I'll go back to being unreachable, is a choice. And choices can be made differently. Yes, that's terrifying. I know. James stood. Slowly, deliberately, the way someone moves when they want the other person to see each part of the movement. He crossed the 3 feet between their chairs and stood in front of her. Close. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the air between them, or she imagined she could. I know exactly what to do with that, he said. Don't. I'm not going to touch you. I know. but I want you to know that I want to. His gloved hand rose, slowly, and stopped an inch from her face. She could see the ridges of the nitrile, the slight tremor in his fingers, the warmth of his palm radiating through the tiny gap between his hand and her cheek. And I want you to know that not touching you is the hardest thing I've done in this room, including the alarm. He held his hand there. 1 inch. The distance between wanting and having. The inch was the clean room, the protocol, the $2.3 million, their careers, every rule they'd agreed to follow. The inch was also the choice to stand this close and not close the distance, and to let the not touching say what touching couldn't yet. For more hours, he said. His voice was rough. 3 hours and 47 minutes, she said. He laughed. Close, in the amber light. His laugh was something she felt as much as heard, a vibration in the air between them, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature control. She memorized it. She was building a library of his sounds, and this one, quiet, close, meant only for the inch between them. She filed in a place she would not lose. His hand dropped. He stepped back. The inch became 3 feet, and the 3 feet were just as unbearable, because she now knew what his hand felt like 1 inch from her face, and almost was a country she'd never visited and never wanted to leave. They sat. They faced each other in the amber light and did not touch and did not pretend they didn't want to. The stainless steel surfaces glowed gold. The HEPA system hummed its constant note. The shadows held them like cupped hands. She didn't know how long they sat like that. Minutes. Half an hour. Long enough for the amber to feel permanent, like the fluorescence had been a temporary interruption, and this warm, shadowed version of the room was what the clean room had always been trying to be. Then the overhead fluorescence kicked back on. 5:22 a.m. Harsh, white, merciless. Without apology. The amber vanished. The shadows evaporated. The steel surfaces went from gold to clinical gray in the space of a blink. The room returned to itself, bright and flat and exactly as controlled as it had been all night, and the moment didn't break so much as it was revealed. The amber hadn't created what was between them. It had only made it visible. In the fluorescent light, it was still there. Just harder to look at directly, the way everything true is harder to look at in bright light. Something had been decided. Not spoken. Decided the way gravity decides which direction to pull, silently, with the understanding that certain things require no agreement because they are already facts. They both knew what would happen when the 12 hours ended. The last hour was the quietest. The final testing cycle ran itself, automated particle counts confirming what 12 hours of data had already established, environmental sensors recording the same nominal conditions they'd recorded all night. The room was performing to specification. It had always been performing to specification. The room, Emery thought, was the only thing in this building that had behaved exactly as designed. She and James had not behaved as designed. They'd been designed by protocol, by professional norms, by the gowning itself, to be two anonymous technicians monitoring a controlled environment for 12 hours. Instead, they had become something the clean room's designers had never accounted for, two people who knew each other, who had, in the specific and controlled absence of every other form of contact, built an intimacy out of voice alone that was more complete than anything Emery had managed in years of face-to-face living. The clock read 7:14 a.m. 46 minutes. I realize, she said, that I know your opinion on loneliness, your ex-wife's feelings about rain, your reading habits, your theory about bioburden narrative structure, the contents of your unpacked boxes, the name of your goldfish, and what your hand looks like 1 inch from my face. But I don't know what you actually look like. You saw a piece. A jaw and one eye is not a complete picture. It's a start. It's a frustrating start. He shifted in his chair. The Tyvek rustled, the sound she'd been hearing all night, the clean room's own language for I'm here, I'm close, I can't touch you. In 46 minutes, she would hear that sound for the last time. What are you doing after this? She asked. I was going to go home and sleep. Was. That plan has changed. What's the new plan? I'm going to stand in the anteroom and take my gloves off very slowly and see if you're still there. Her laugh filled the clean room for the last time. The HEPA system took it, filtered it, returned it as silence, the same thing the room had been doing to every real sound she'd made since 8 p.m. She was done letting this room absorb things. "I'll be there," she said. The last 46 minutes were a new kind of agony, the particular torture of sitting across from someone you want to touch in a room that forbids it, watching a digital clock count toward a number you've been waiting for since hour 6. They didn't talk about what would happen after. They talked about small things, his favorite restaurant in Portland, her running route along the Willamette, the particular quality of Oregon mornings in early spring when the gray starts to thin and you can almost believe the sun is a real thing that happens to real people. It was surface conversation that felt nothing like surface because they'd gone so far below it already that even the shallow end was deep. At 7:52, she began the final documentation. Particle counts confirmed across all stations. Environmental conditions nominal, logged across 12 continuous hours. Sensor fault from the alarm noted with redundant data supporting test validity. She signed the qualification record Emery Voss, contamination control specialist, and passed the tablet to James. He signed below her. James Nakano, process engineering. Their gloved fingers didn't touch on the handoff. She was aware of this the way she was aware of the air temperature, precisely, constantly, with her entire body. At 7:58, they powered down the monitoring equipment. The particle counters went silent one by one, click, 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 then nothing. The environmental sensors blinked off. The digital displays faded to black. The only sound left was the HEPA system, humming its constant note, filtering air in a room that no longer needed to be clean for anyone. At 8 a.m., the clock hit 12 hours. "Test complete," she said. "Test complete," he confirmed. They looked at each other across the last 5 feet of clean room. Two shapes in Tyvek. Two voices that had spent 12 hours becoming the most familiar sounds in each other's lives. She could see the outline of him, hood, goggles, coverall, the anonymous uniform that had made this entire night possible, and beneath all of it, the person. Not visible. Known. "Anteroom," he said. "Anteroom." The airlock doors opened with the same hiss they'd made 12 hours ago. When she'd entered this room as a contamination control specialist, doing her job, and not as a woman who'd said, "I like rooms with rules" to a stranger, and then spent the next 11 hours discovering that she liked this room specifically. With this specific stranger, more than she liked any room in recent memory. The clean room released them without ceremony. The HEPA system continued humming. It would hum for hours, filtering air for no one, maintaining a standard that no longer needed to be maintained. The room didn't care that they were leaving. The room had never cared about anything. The anteroom was small, 10 feet by 12, lit by standard fluorescence, similar to the clean room but warmer, the air slightly less controlled, slightly more forgiving. There were lockers along one wall, a bench, and a mirror neither of them had looked in for 12 hours. The double doors sealed behind them with a soft click, and the anteroom air settled around them like a different atmosphere. Not unfiltered, the anteroom had its own air handling, but looser, more human. The kind of air that allowed for imperfections and particles and breath that hadn't been scrubbed clean of every trace of the person who exhaled it. They stood facing each other, 3 feet apart. In the smaller space, he was closer than 3 feet had felt in the clean room, because the anteroom's walls pressed inward and the ceiling pressed down, and there was nowhere to retreat to except the lockers behind them. He reached for his goggles first. She watched his gloved hands, the hands she'd been watching all night, the hands she'd imagined under the nitrile, the hands that had stopped 1 inch from her face in the amber light, grip the elastic strap and pull. The goggles came away from his face with a soft, wet sound of suction breaking, and underneath them, eyes. Dark brown, tired, creased at the corners from 12 hours of pressure. Real. Looking at her with an expression she'd only heard in his voice until now, focused, steady, unguarded. The specific look of someone who is seeing her, as if seeing were not a passive reception of light, but an active choice, a decision to look and keep looking and not look away. He was not what she'd imagined. He was better because he was actual. Because imagination, however vivid, was still a clean room, controlled, idealized, free of the particles that made a real face interesting. His face had particles, faint lines around his eyes, a small scar above his left eyebrow she'd never have known about, skin that was exactly the color it was and not the color she'd guessed. The face was specific and real and imperfect, and she wanted to look at it for a very long time. She removed her goggles. The anteroom came into sharper focus, brighter, harder edged, the prescription neutral lenses no longer softening everything into clean room approximation. He was looking at her the way she was looking at him, with the raw, slightly stunned expression of someone who had known a voice for 12 hours and was now meeting the face that made it. Neither of them spoke. Speaking, after 12 hours of it, felt almost redundant. They had said everything. Now it was time for the rest. The hood came next. She pulled hers off first, a deliberate choice, an act of faith, the decision to let him see her before she was ready to be seen. Her hair was compressed flat against her skull, damp at the temples, plastered into shapes that no human being would voluntarily present to someone they were trying to impress. She didn't care. She didn't want to be impressive. She wanted to be actual. He pulled his off. Dark hair, slightly too long, freed from the elastic with a visible relief that made him look 5 years younger. A red crease ran across his forehead where the hood had pressed all night. His face, the full face, not the fragment she glimpsed through the cracked hood, was more interesting than handsome, the kind of face that rewarded attention. Strong jaw, dark eyes, a mouth that looked like it was always almost smiling. The slightly dazed expression of someone who'd been awake and honest for too long and wasn't trying to hide either fact. "Hi," she said. "Hi." His voice was the same. The voice she knew. But attached to a mouth, a jaw, a full expression. It was both familiar and brand new, like hearing a song she'd memorized performed live for the first time, every note the same, but the experience entirely different. The coveralls. She reached for her zipper. The sound it made in a small room was obscenely loud after 12 hours of hepahum, a ripping, industrial, completely unromantic sound that had no business being as charged as it was. She unzipped slowly, not to perform, because everything was slow now. Because every layer she removed was a barrier dissolving, and she wanted to feel each dissolution the way you feel a held breath finally release, completely, down to the bottom of the lungs. She stepped out of the Tyvek. Underneath, her own clothes, wrinkled from 12 hours of compression. A dark sweater, soft against skin that had been sealed in synthetic fabric since 8 p.m. Jeans that felt almost indecently textured after the smooth nothing of the coverall. Socks with a hole in the left toe she'd noticed at 6 a.m. and decided was irrelevant. She was rumpled and creased and imperfect and entirely herself for the first time since she'd walked into this building. He unzipped his coverall, stepped out of it. A gray t-shirt, dark pants, the ordinary clothes of a person who existed outside of clean rooms in a world with coffee and weather and furniture that could be rearranged. He looked like someone she might have passed on the street and never noticed, except she'd spent 12 hours learning the architecture of his mind, and now his face was a place she recognized. The gloves. He peeled off the outer pair. Then the inner pair, slowly, finger by finger, and she understood that the slowness was deliberate. That he was keeping his promise. "I'm going to stand in the anteroom and take my gloves off very slowly." Each finger freed from nitrile was a small act of revelation. His hands emerged, slightly red from compression, the skin tender and vulnerable from 12 hours of confinement. Long fingers. A callus on his right index finger from she didn't know. A pen, a tool, a guitar. She didn't know, and she wanted to. She pulled off her outer gloves. Then the inner pair, and the air hit her skin like a language she'd forgotten she spoke. Anteroom air imperfect, uncontrolled, full of particles, and the smell of coffee drifting from somewhere down the hall and the faint, impossible scent of another person. After 12 hours of scrubbed nothing, of air so clean it had no personality, the sensory flood was almost painful. The world had taste again. Texture. Temperature. The specific warmth of air that had been breathed by someone standing 3 feet away. They stood there, 3 feet apart, hands bare, faces bare. Every barrier removed. Neither of them moved. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't uncertainty. It was the muscle memory of 12 hours of not touching, a protocol that had been written into their bodies so deeply that the official end of it didn't matter. Her hands were bare and his hands were bare, and the air between them was unfiltered, and there was no $2.3 million reason to maintain distance, and still they stood. Because almost had been their language all night, and the body doesn't switch languages in an instant. She looked at his hands. He looked at hers. 3 feet of anteroom air. The most crossable, uncrossable distance in the world. I don't know how to be the one who, she started. He stepped toward her. One step. The distance closed from 3 feet to one. His hand rose, the same gesture from the clean room, the hand that had hovered 1 inch from her face in the amber light. But there was no protocol now. No hood. No gloves. No $2.3 million reason to stop. His fingers touched her wrist. The inside, where the pulse lived. 12 hours of not touching detonated. Not violently, the opposite. A slow, expanding wave of sensation that started at the point where his thumb met her skin and radiated outward through her entire body like warmth through cold water. His skin was warm from the gloves, slightly damp, and the imperfection of it, the real human fact of warmth and moisture, and the slight roughness of a fingertip that had been confined, was so vivid after 12 hours of nothing that her nervous system processed it as revelation. Her pulse hammered against his thumb, and she knew he could feel it, and she didn't try to steady it, and the not steadying was its own kind of freedom. Is this, he started. Yes, she said, before the question. His other hand found her jaw, the side of her face that had been hidden behind a hood for 12 hours, that he'd never seen, that was now bare and open and his to touch. His palm was warm and her skin was starved, and the contact sent a current through her that had nothing to do with the room's electrical system and everything to do with what 12 hours of constraint had built between them. A charge so specific and so patient that its release was almost unbearable. She put her hand on his face. The jaw she'd seen through the cracked hood, the cheekbone she'd imagined, the skin that was warm and rough with stubble and real in a way that no amount of voice could substitute for, because voices were intimate, but skin was proof. Skin was here, actual now. The kiss started slow because they'd been waiting for it so long that rushing felt like waste. His mouth was warm and tasted like 12 hours and filtered air and the specific flavor of a person you've known by voice and are now learning by touch. Her hand moved from his jaw to the back of his neck, where his hair was damp from the hood, and he made a sound against her mouth that was half relief and half hunger and entirely honest. His hand slid from her wrist to her waist and pulled her closer with a gentleness that devastated her more thoroughly than urgency would have. They pressed together in the small, bright, imperfect anteroom, two people in wrinkled clothes with creased foreheads and compressed hair, holding each other with the desperate tenderness of the previously deprived. His mouth found the spot below her ear where her neck met her jaw, and she heard herself make a sound the clean room would have swallowed, but the anteroom let live. Her fingers found the collar of his T-shirt, the warm skin beneath it, and the difference between nitrile and fingertips was the difference between reading about the ocean and standing in it. The bench was behind her. She backed into it, or he guided her, or they moved together. The mechanics less important than the fact of closer, more, here. They sat, tangled and breathing, his forehead pressed against hers, sharing the same unfiltered air. I should tell you, she whispered, that I don't do this. This specifically? Any of this. The talking, the honesty. His thumb traced her collarbone through the sweater, and the sentence dissolved. That? I should tell you I don't either. Then what are we doing? Something new, he said, and kissed her again, and she decided that new was exactly the right word for the feeling of being known by someone who learned your mind before your face. The small room with its lockers and its bench and its ordinary fluorescent light held them while time, which had stopped meaning anything at midnight, stopped entirely. Afterward, minutes or an hour, impossible and irrelevant to determine, they sat on the bench in the anteroom, side by side, rumpled, breathing air that was full of particles and coffee scent and each other. The fluorescent light was unflattering and neither of them cared. He was holding her hand. bare hand in bare hand, fingers interlaced, his skin still slightly red from the nitrile and hers still buzzing with the memory of 12 hours without contact. The most ordinary thing in the world. The most extraordinary thing that had happened in this room. She looked at their hands. His fingers threaded through hers, the callus on his right index finger pressing against her knuckle. She still didn't know what had made the callus. She had time to find out. "I don't know how to do this outside of a clean room," she said. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. He didn't offer reassurance she hadn't asked for. He sat with the sentence the way he'd sat with everything she'd said all night fully, with attention, giving it the space it needed to mean what it meant. "You don't need the room," he said. "You just needed someone to stay for the 12 hours." The sentence landed the way his sentences had been landing all night, quietly, precisely, in a place she hadn't known was exposed. She sat with it, turned it over in the fluorescent light. Someone to stay for the 12 hours. Not someone to fix her. Not someone to reach her. Someone to stay. To sit in the discomfort of her silence and the challenge of her distance and the slow, difficult process of her trust, and to still be there when the timer ran out. Ryan hadn't stayed. Ryan had reached and reached and reached and then left when the reaching didn't work. James had sat in a chair 5 feet away and waited, and the waiting had done what reaching never could. The room hadn't made her honest. James had. His questions, his silences, his willingness to wait for real answers instead of accepting professional ones. The room had just removed the exits. "I'm going to be difficult," she said. "Outside this building, I'm going to be the person who keeps the boxes packed, who controls the variables, who chooses clean rooms over messy ones." "Keeps the boxes packed," he repeated. Something shifted in his voice, the recognition of his own metaphor, reflected back. She had told him to open his boxes. Now she was telling him she'd keep hers closed. The parallel was not lost on either of them. "I'm going to have my face back," she said. "And I'm going to use it to maintain distance, because that's what I do. I know. It's not going to be easy. I didn't ask for easy. I asked what you were doing after this." He squeezed her hand. "My original plan was going home to sleep. The revised plan involved anteroom glove removal. I can revise further." "To what?" "Coffee. Tomorrow. In a room with no protocol and no gowning and whatever particle count nature provides." "That's terrifying." "I know. I'll be there anyway." "I know that too." She looked at him fully, without barrier, in the flat, honest light of the anteroom. James Nakano. Tired. Real. Hair going in 3 directions. Forehead crease from the hood fading to a thin pink line. The specific expression of someone who had been awake and honest for 12 continuous hours and was not performing anything at all. She kissed him once more. Briefly, deliberately, with her hands on his face, in the bright, imperfect light. Not because 12 hours of deprivation demanded it, that debt had been paid. Because she wanted to. Because wanting, it turned out, was available to her. She had just needed a room with rules strict enough to make wanting safe, and a person patient enough to wait while she figured that out. They gathered their things from the lockers. She checked her phone, 6 missed texts from her mother, a calendar reminder she'd already forgotten about, the ordinary clutter of a life she'd paused at 8 p.m. and was now picking back up, slightly different. He packed his procedural manual into a bag and caught her watching. "The bioburden chapter," he said. "You should really read it." "I'm not reading your procedural manual. The denouement is very satisfying. You're impossible. I've been told I'm quite reachable, actually. By a reliable source." She laughed. The anteroom let the sound live, no HEPA system to absorb it, no filtered air to sanitize it. It rang off the lockers and the tile floor and the mirror and his face, which was doing the thing she'd only heard until now, smiling. They walked out of the facility together, past the lobby where the day shift was arriving with coffee and lanyards, and the particular Tuesday morning energy of people who had no idea what had happened overnight in the clean room down the hall. The automatic doors opened, and the outside air hit Emery like a wave. Oregon morning. Early March. Gray sky pressing down like a soft hand, low clouds carrying the particular Pacific Northwest light that couldn't decide between silver and pearl. The parking lot smelled like wet asphalt and pine needles and the distant mineral tang of overnight rain. The air was cool and damp and full of pollen and car exhaust, and the green smell of Douglas fir, and the 10,000 particles per cubic foot that would have sent the clean room's alarms into cardiac arrest. Uncontrolled, unfiltered. The messy, chaotic, contaminated air of the actual world, where nothing was clean and nothing was certain, and the rules were the ones you chose for yourself. She breathed it in. His hand found hers. Bare skin on bare skin. No protocol. No barrier. No $2.3 million reason to let go. Just the ordinary, extraordinary fact of touching someone and meaning it in the open air, in the imperfect morning, in a parking lot that smelled like rain. She let it